Hello, everyone, and welcome to the briefing room from the World Economic Forum. I'm Sadia Zahidi, and today we're diving into one of the most pressing questions on the global agenda. In the midst of seemingly non-stop disruption, what is the outlook for the global economy? For our September edition of the Chief Economist's Outlook, we asked leading voices from across sectors and regions to share their views. The results reveal both risks and opportunities at this critical moment for the global economy. Now, to help us unpack the findings, I'm joined here in New York by three chief economists. Neela Richardson, Chief Economist and ESG Officer at ADP, where she leads ADP's research. Pedro Conceição, Director of the Human Development Report Office at the UNDP. And Paul Grunwald, Global Chief Economist at S&P Global. Thank you all for being here and welcome to the briefing room. Now, back in May, when we published our last Chief Economist's Outlook, trade policy uncertainty had reached a historical peak. At that point, the picture was pretty grim. Most chief economists, in fact all, told us that the global economy would be weaker or even much weaker in the year ahead. This time around, that sentiment has eased slightly. About 72% still expect a weakening, but that is better than before. So things look slightly better, but we're starting from a very low base. Now, the big question is, how much confidence can we really have in the growth prospects of a global economy that is restructuring? And what might that new order actually look like? Now, we'll get to that big question, but let's talk just about the year ahead. So 72%, so 3/4, still expecting that we're looking at a weaker outlook in the year ahead. Yes, slightly better than before, but still overall quite negative. Do you agree? Paul, let's start with you.
Yeah, we see this as a battle between the resilience that we've seen for the last couple of years since the pandemic and all the policy uncertainty and unpredictability coming out of the U.S. We did have a better second quarter, and looks like we're having a better third quarter than before. So firms and consumers are adjusting to the tariffs imposed by the U.S., but we've still got a lot of policy overhang. So just as a very quick example, the narrowness of the U.S. labor market, the narrowness of the foundation is one of the things we're focusing on. It's really just one sector now that's growing, which is hospitality. And also on investment, we're seeing a nice uptick from data centers, but almost everything else is flat. So we're both slowing and narrowing, so we're still in a relatively risky environment.
Okay. Neela, your view.
You know, uncertainty has become its own economic actor, and it's influencing all kinds of decisions, right? But where we see stability is an economy, especially in the U.S., that's anchored to the consumer. And that consumer is being held up by a very stable labor market. Yes, it is weakening, and that's for sure. Hiring momentum has slowed considerably since the beginning of the year, but we're still in this low higher equilibrium for the consumer. So if you have a job, you're still able to spend resiliently. Now, if that ever changes, if that connection relationship weakens even further, where even those that have a job are not certain that they'll keep that job, we might see a very different growth picture in the next 4 months than we're seeing right now.
Thank you. And Pedro, your more global view, perhaps.
Yes, I think maybe I would just make 2 points. First, looking back a little bit and seeing what has happened recently and drawing on the findings of our latest Human Development Report, which includes economic activity but goes beyond that and looks at things like health and education. What we found was that progress in human development is at its slowest level ever. So there has just been a slowdown, and I think part of the outlook is driven by this sharp slowdown in economic growth, at least in progress in human development. But the second interesting finding from the outlook was, as you alluded to, Sadia, the fact that we moved from all economists saying the economy is going to get worse to, I guess, 90% saying that it's going to get worse. So something happened over the last few months that instilled, at least in some people, the hope that things might actually get better. And I think this is testimony to the fact that the world didn't collapse despite all that uncertainty. And I think this might be a reason for some hope going forward. So I think things globally still look, towards the downside when it comes to global growth. I think it's a continuation of a trend, but again, things didn't collapse, so there might be some hope.
Thank you. Just picking a little bit on that piece. So the outlook for North America in general seems to be quite low. The outlook for Europe also not exactly upbeat. But there are parts of the world where, at least for the year ahead, for the next couple of years, there are relatively positive views from the chief economists, notably Middle East and North Africa. Any views on that from any of you?
I think that's where you're seeing some investments. I mean, this is Climate Week, and you're seeing investments in energy and even in the Middle East, a more broad-based look at energy and where it's sourced from, including renewables. And you're also seeing this idea of AI and data centers take place in some parts of the world. So the thing about data centers aren't factories. They don't need to be close to the capital, and they don't really need to be close to the worker. Now that opens up a whole Pandora's box of other issues. But when you look at investments and what the investments into the future are, they're increasingly happening in those areas of the world.
Yeah, the Middle East is also being driven by Vision 2030 in Saudi, and that, as we know, is a huge project trying to diversify that economy away from fossil fuel. So that's definitely one of the bright spots. Sadia, I would point to Europe a little bit. We don't really think of Europe always as a bright spot, but we think over the next few years, because of the new focus on beefing up defense and infrastructure and the Germans releasing the debt brake, we're going to see a little bit of a pickup in Europe. It's not going to be Chinese-style growth rates or anything like that. But if we're looking for a region that might do a little bit better than we've been used to over the last decade or so, maybe we could look at Europe as they rebuild and try to achieve a little bit more strategic autonomy. I think that's the term they use.
You. Pedro?
Could I just add a point? I think that even though the outlook for some of the lower income regions is more positive than for the global economy and some of the high income regions, I think the real question is the level of growth relative to what we would need. I mean, these are regions that should be growing at double-digit rates, and that's not what's expected at all. So I would still look at the economic performance of these lower income regions with great concern.
Okay. So we're starting to develop a basic idea of where things are headed and maybe starting to point to what has led to a slight uptick in optimism when it comes to the views of the chief economist. How much do you think is simply factoring in the uncertainty?
Yeah, the uptick for us was really revising the historical data, so the base got a little bit higher. We didn't really fundamentally change our view going forward, which is the policy uncertainty is going to be dampening growth. We've got structural problems in places like China with the property market, and we have trade kind of adjusting to the tariffs. But even though we're a little bit better, a lot of that was just kind of a base effect. We haven't, as I said, really changed our view going forward. That we're in a tricky and disruptive environment.
Okay.
Yeah,
Hila, you said the next 4 months might look a little different. Tell us more.
It might. The hiring momentum in the U.S. is certainly a factor, and it's going to continue to be a factor. But offsetting that slowing momentum is higher pay growth than we saw going before the pandemic. So, when you think about the consumer and its resiliency, whether in the U.S. or in Europe or in other parts of the world that have a strong consumer base, that's still fairly intact. And I think that's why the outlook has improved a little bit, that the consumer has seen through the uncertainty enough to purchase stuff. They may still feel bad about it, and you can see that in the sentiment indices, but it's not yet affecting spending in a massive way that slows down their foothold on the economy. If that were to change, it would start in the labor market, and so that's the first place I'd look. And if you look broadly outside of the United States, you're looking at unemployment rates that are broadly better than they have been historically. Not great, not perfect, not everywhere, but when you compare the 2025 labor market to 10 years ago, you're seeing improvement, and that supports a consumer base globally. The catch of all this is I think tariffs are slow burn. We all expected as economists to see an immediate hit of those tariff impacts, and it didn't come. And it may not come this year. So in reality, it looks like the changes in trade policy is not a short-term outcome. It's a longer term, and it'll get conflated with structural change in the global economy rather than real-time cyclical change in which a lot of economists expected to see this year.
I actually agree with Nila. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there was an expectation in May or in April, perhaps, when the survey was conducted, that sort of the world would collapse, right? And then it didn't collapse. So I think there was an adjustment in the expectation that may be driving a little bit of the optimism. And then another realization, perhaps, is that there's a lot of trade that's happening within regions that are really not affected that much by the decisions of the United States. 3/4 of the trade in Europe, for instance, is within Europe itself. So there's a lot of trade still happening that is sort of isolated from the tariffs. What I think is of concern is not so much the direct effects on trade, which may take time to unfold and may be relatively limited, but is the context of uncertainty that we're living with today.
Okay, so I want to stay broad just a little bit more. You mentioned low fire, low hire. What about the structural change from artificial intelligence? Are you starting to see any indication of that? I'll start with you, Nila, because you're watching a lot of that data.
Yes, it's impacting the labor market. Stanford University, our partner on the National Employment Report that ADP produces, used ADP data to actually look at this effect. And they looked at AI-exposed industries versus AI non-exposed. Think healthcare and software developers, so a healthcare aide versus a software developer. And what they found is early career professionals in AI fields are actually losing ground. So the AI tool is not obvious. It depends on whether it automates your work or augments their work, and there's profound, massive upside potential in the augmentation. But in the transition there, it affects different groups differently, and I expected all of us would be worrying about our jobs, and in fact, it's our kids who should be worried in those AI-exposed fields, because when you think about what AI can do as a tool, it's basically anything that affects a document or a spreadsheet, which is what early career in the business world depends on, and computer programming. So when you talk about human development, it's about matching where AI tools take hold and automate work with that development potential, especially it looks like in early career, and pushing people into those fields and tasks that actually are augmentative. And that we've seen great success in the data.
And Paul, markets are incredibly upbeat about the potential of AI, to the extent that some are worried that this might be a bubble. I mean, tell us your view.
Yeah, well, first of all, we see AI in the investment data in the U.S. We see it in building the data centers. We see it in equipping the data center with the racks and the mainframes. We see it empowering the data center. The big question is all this investment going to pay off, right? This is largely self-funded by the big hyperscalers, so there's not really a credit story too much, but it is a model where you've put a lot of resources. Every week we hear of a new, larger factory coming on with more capacity. Is this going to generate the revenue streams down the road to justify the valuations? That's number one. And number two, Nell kind of alluded to this, ultimately, we would want to see this as a productivity story, right? If we're going to move the medium-term growth needle, the way to do that is to have, a rise in labor productivity or total factor productivity. And estimates of economists are all over the place, from basically 0 to 1+% per year for half a decade. So that's unknown at this point, but we're going to be tracking that very closely.
And do you think both things could be true, to have rising productivity in certain sectors,
well,
and then at the same time
there's good productivity and bad productivity, right? If you can do the same stuff with fewer people, that's not great for employment. But if you're augmenting and there's new possibilities, then it's a positive story. But that's very much still in play.
If you want long-term, I mean, what macroeconomics teaches you over a 2-year frame, I'm going to boil it down to 2 sentences, is that growth comes from more workers and those workers becoming more productive. And so what AI promises is not only productivity in its source country, but because a lot of our work is digital, even that home healthcare aide will one day be digitally augmented, maybe by a robot in the house that helps with the heavy lifting, literally, because work is becoming so digitized. that also comes with an upside that development can be digitized, that upskilling can happen massively and globally so that you don't have to be in the country. I think of work and people as the new globalization. You'll need it. US is aging very quickly. Europe is even ahead of the US by some countries decades. So there needs to be something else that fuels this globalization of where the young workers will be, Africa, South Asia, and where the technology is, and kind of marries them in a way that supports growth going forward. So long term, there's like a lot of reasons to be positive and optimistic, and maybe our chief economist will be too, but in the short term, it's how do you get to that long-term scenario?
Right. And Pedro, the latest Human Development Report was all about AI. What do you think? What does that look like from the perspective of developing economies?
One of the things we did was ask people around the world. So it's not a prediction by economists, but we asked people, we conducted a survey around the world, and what do they expect AI to mean for them in their lives? Do they expect automation or augmentation? And two interesting findings. First is that the occupations and countries that expect more automation to take place also expect more augmentation to take place. So the two sort of go hand in hand. And the second thing that we found was that the expectations, so it's not the prediction, right? But what people expect around the world is that the impact of AI is going to be tilted, biased towards augmentation. So I think we have a responsibility collectively to make sure that we respond positively to this expectation. So I think people are realistic. They predict some automation to take place, some displacement to occur, but for the most part, they expect AI to augment what they can do. Particularly, actually, perhaps surprising, at least to us, in lower income countries, in lower income settings, that's where this expectation for augmentation is more heightened, more salient.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about that big picture, potentially a little bit of that emerging economic order, talked about the geoeconomics, but as you said, the world didn't fall apart, and we're starting to factor in some of those transformations. With artificial intelligence, the jury's out. We're seeing lots of investments. We're also seeing lots of worry about the labor market. So let's hold that thought. We'll come back to this. Let's now turn to the regional picture. Because obviously the global outlook isn't the same everywhere, and you've all started touching upon that. Beneath the surface, there is a wide variety of regional stories. Chief economists expect increasing inflationary pressures in the US in the year ahead, and a narrow majority anticipate either weak or very weak growth there. Now, while the growth outlook in China is less of a concern, the country continues to fight deflation. Across regions, the outlook reveals notable differences. The Middle East and North Africa emerges as the region with the strongest outlook. 37% of the surveyed chief economists now anticipate strong or very strong growth there in the coming year, a significant uptick compared to the previous edition. South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific are not far behind, with almost a third sharing the same optimistic outlook. Now, the outlook for Europe is more cautious. While inflation is stable and anticipated to remain that way, most of the surveyed chief economists anticipate growth to remain moderate at best. Okay, so that's the view from our community. And of course, those of you who, and in fact, I believe all three of you did contribute to that survey. What's your take? And Paul, let me start with you.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to generalize, right? So we have the U.S. dealing with the political uncertainty. As I mentioned, Europe has got the, the slight bump from strategic autonomy. China's dealing with the property slowdown. But I think the middle powers, another way to read what you just went through, Sadia, is we've got these middle powers. We have Saudi, we have India, we have Brazil, and we have to think about these countries that are going to be powering growth as China slows down, and they're doing infrastructure and investment build out. One thing we focused on that wasn't maybe directly in here was the pattern of trade. China's no longer being driven by trade with the U.S. and Europe, and there's a big push into the global south. It's Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and that's kind of rewiring almost the global trade patterns and maybe political influence that goes with that. And a lot of that's going to be clean tech, and we have an energy transformation component to that. So it's kind of exciting. I mean, sometimes the emerging markets are maybe too exuberant, but this looks like a reasonably decent fundamental story. story, and growth maybe being a little bit more broad-based than what we've seen before.
And within China, domestically, do you see some signs of optimism?
Yeah, well, I mean, the government can still pull the levers and keep the growth close to target. So they posted 5% growth for the first part of the year. It's really the structural overhang from property, not so much in the first-tier cities, but the second and third-tier cities. And I think that kind of overinvestment, excess supply is dampening savings and dampening consumption. The challenge for China has been the same for a long time. So, I used to be with the IMF, and I was working on the China team 20, 25 years ago, and it was really almost the same story. They need to get the investment rate down, consumption up, rebalance the economy, and they're still struggling with that. China's still a structural oversupply economy. It needs to export that to the rest of the world, and we're kind of still in that movie.
And what are some of the opportunities, and Pedro, I'll turn to you on this, what are some of the opportunities created for the rest of the world because of the current relationship and outlook between the US and China? And you alluded to that, lots of opportunity for some parts of the world. What's your take on that?
I think one way of looking at what Paul has just described is that the potential benefit goes beyond just the static gains from trade, but also from the more dynamic gains from trade. So as these relationships with China perhaps intensify, the economic trade relationships with China intensify, along with it might come technological transfer, knowledge transfer, particularly around newer technologies, around AI, digital technologies more broadly, the green transition. So if this pans out in this way, and it's a big if, I think this is actually the opportunity. So I think we should look at the benefits of trade beyond just the static short-term gains, but potentially the long-term gains that could come along with knowledge transfer, technology transfer, and this transition towards green economies, using AI to power growth in the service sector, because in the manufacturing sector it remains difficult in many parts of the world, but perhaps in the service sector there's an opportunity here to increase productivity.
Thank you. And Neela, your take on both work and wages in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I was thinking the divergence in the regional paths is clear. And for countries, they're actually experiencing transitions they've never or haven't experienced in a while, like Japan and inflation, and Germany being more accommodative fiscally. These are new things that are upending how we think about our own U.S. debt. Now that there could be an EU maybe complement to that debt. It might be a little harder to sell the U.S. Treasuries than it's been in the past. So these are things that we took for granted 5 years ago. We can't take for granted. So what I think about when you think about work itself, it's clear to me that countries are on their own path, but they're leading to the same destination. What I mean by that is there's one shared transition that no one can escape, and that's demographics. Time comes for us all. You can't escape it. And where you see the working age population shifting to and the need of advanced economies, whether it's China, Japan, Europe, or the US, to source people and talent from different parts of the world than they used to. And this is not just cheaper talent. This is skilled talent. That countries desperately need to fuel their innovation. That's what unites us all. So long term, I think the prospects for rising standards of living are strong if we can get over a geographical hurdle in terms of where hiring happens. I think that is the next problem to solve after we figure out the supply chains, is how do we source the talent where it is as opposed to where the capital is. That's a big global growth story.
So that is potentially a very bright outlook. But how is that possible in a world that is more deeply divided, that is more polarized, where it's not just trade that is being questioned, where there are borders up in very different ways than there have been before? So how do you see some of that playing out?
I think work is less geographically determined than it's ever been in human history. If you look at the United States, the number of people working remotely, hybrid, in virtual teams has soared post-pandemic. We have the technology to make this happen. And skills have never been so easy to acquire. They're there, but they're hard to retain because the skill sets are changing so rapidly. So we have the tools. Much like most things that we say are scarce, there's actually an abundance of it. It's just the distribution mechanism that is lacking. So I guess I'm positive on the fact that necessity is the mother of invention, and so we will figure this out because we'll have to, not because necessarily countries want to politically, it's because they have to for businesses to operate successfully.
Yeah, I would push back a little bit on the deglobalization thing too. So if we go back to the spring meetings of the IMF, and I saw you there, the U.S. is clearly reevaluating its role as the benevolent hegemon of the global economy and pulling back a bit from globalization. But my reading was the rest of the world's pretty much still all in, right? Europe is all in, the global South is all in. So yes, a big important country is pulling back from its historic role in a globalized world, but the rest of the world still seems all in. We'll still have to figure out how to get the labor flows and whether that has to be physical or virtual or whatever. But it's not doom and gloom where everyone's pulling back from globalization. I think it's really seems to be mostly a U.S. thing at this point.
I agree with Paul and Nila, but I would, and I think that was the question you were raising. I think the politics here matter a lot. And even though economic rationality would lead us to believe that the best solution is to have this reallocation of labor, particularly if we look at demographics, the domestic politics in different countries make it very, very hard. And we're seeing that happening and panning out in Europe as well. And actually, there's a contradiction between what we see from business surveys that tell us, for instance, in Italy, that the greatest constraint that businesses in Italy find is people. They just don't have people. And the politics that make it so hard for people outside of Italy to come into the country. I mean, I'm saying Italy, but it's many other countries. So I think it depends a lot on how this challenge is sort of navigated in different political processes. But I don't think it's a US story alone. It's a story that we're seeing playing out. So there is a tension here between the economic needs, the business needs, and the politics, perhaps more something more emotional that is, so it's creating this tension, and we'll see how we can navigate it.
So I'm going to oversimplify here, but if North-South trade and flow of technology and flow of people, whether digital or physical, if all of that is under question, I mean, do you see some bright spots when it comes to South-South relationships?
If we can decouple from, let's call it I think the more we can decouple from the physical relative to the digital, I think that's better for the global South. If you look at the global economy in the three manufacturing centers where a lot of the good jobs are, that's the US, let's call it Greater Germany, and Eastern China, and a lot of things just feed into those. Those are the center of production. Trade is around there. A lot of the global South just exports commodities into those regions. If we can, decouple the physical part of production and make it more virtual, I think that's going to make it easier for the global South. And conversely, the more we're locked into those kind of physical manufacturing, and that's been the path to growth, right? Europe, the US, Japan, everybody, if that's the way you have to go, it's going to be more difficult if that's less virtual.
But again, Sadi, I come back to the point. Yes, potentially in the short run, the static gains can be sort of achieved with South-South in the way that Paul is describing. But the story of development is not only a story of trade, is a dynamic story of what comes along with trade, right? It's the ideas, it's the technology. So if it is just a South-South story, I think that that potential to gain technology transfer, knowledge transfer, the pressure for institutional reform as more like-minded countries speak and trade with each other, all of that is going to be limited quite a bit. So yes, maybe in the short run, countries will do that. But I think that the dynamic gains from globalization, if you want to use that expression, are going to be limited if we retreat from this global process of trade.
Thank you. Nila?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, it's almost like the introspection of investment can't really happen. It has to be an extroverted look at the rest of the world, right? None of us can grow in isolation, whether it's north-south, south-south, or just north. because we all lack the components for all these multi-phase transitions. It's energy, it's people, it's trade, it's technology, and no country has a monopoly on everything needed for growth anymore. Growth has become harder than it's ever been in the past. And you have to bring millions, billions of people along with you. So a South-South growth prospect, to me, looks as dim as a North-South or completely North. I don't think any country is an island anymore, and they have to grow with partners.
Okay, thank you. Now, chief economists, and perhaps this is now a repeating pattern, but they're fairly downbeat on the prospects of that type of global convergence happening. So let's take a look at what's going on between countries at that global scale. While the global economy has shown remarkable resilience, and I think all of you have emphasized that, its ongoing transformation could potentially make it harder for some countries to follow that traditional path of development. To your point, if it is that traditional path. Now, according to the chief economists we surveyed, developing economies might drift further apart from their advanced counterparts in the near future, and the data tells a clear story. More than half of the chief economists now expect greater divergence between developing and advanced economies within the next few years. 32% expect the gaps as they are currently to persist, while only 12% think developing economies will actually catch up in the next 3 years. So very low expectations of any convergence in the next 3 years. And I think that time frame might be what's determining this, because some of the things that you're all saying are the big bets for change in the future might really be outside of that 3-year time frame. But the next 3 years look like relatively difficult ones for growth and catch up and broader development in the developing world. Your thoughts?
Well, I answered with a lot of concern, so I'm disclosing my answer to the survey. And again, here I think we can look back, and when it comes to human development, for instance, what we have seen is that over 30+ years there was a process of convergence, but over the last 4 years there's actually a divergence in human development between the countries at the top and at the bottom. So, I think, looking ahead in the short run, for the reasons that we've been discussing, it's very hard to see that process reversing. So yes, I share the view of the majority of the economists that prospects for convergence are limited in the short run.
Nila?
I mean, in some ways, the convergence is happening in the wrong direction, right? Emerging markets are slowing down their growth, and they're coming closer to advanced economy growth rates, which is not what we need for living standards to rise. So, and one way to answer that question is that there's too much convergence. We want emerging markets to leapfrog ahead of us. We want them to skip the negative parts of industrialization, like pollution, but that's not happening. They're actually repeating the mistakes of the past oftentimes, instead of working around them. So I would like to, I'm flipping your question intentionally, I'd like to see more divergence in terms of how these emerging economies develop in a new world. Not repeating the mistakes of the past, not going through the painful industrialization of advanced economies, but actually learning from it, investing in renewables, having growth partners, aiding human development, meeting the challenges of demographics. There's a lot that could happen in a diverging, emerging world that would advance them way more than following a traditional convergent path.
And you've just laid out there some features of what might be that emerging new global order. And that was another broad theme in the Outlook this year, just trying to define what that might look like. And Paul, maybe I'll turn it over to you first. I mean, your definition.
That's the tricky one. Well, we know where we've been, and it was the Washington Consensus, and that was a world where, you know, Trade was good, free flow of capital was good, markets were good, the role of the government was to stand back and force the rules, and then the market did most of the hard work. We're not in that world anymore. The question is, what's the new one going to look like? I still think we're in a transition phase, but I think we know the elements now of what the new order might look like, even if we're not there. One is it's going to be multipolar. It's not going to be only US-led. We're going to have multiple power centers. Two, it's going to have a security overlay, right? We have geopolitical tensions, and the Washington consensus really was kind of borderless with no security. Three, as we've discussed, it's going to have a tech element, right? AI is going to be in there. It's going to be transformational. We're not sure exactly how that shakes out. And I would say the fourth one is going to have an element of sustainability, right? So I think all those four are going to be in there. How they kind of, get calibrated is up for grabs. But I think that's probably the mixture of the soup. We don't know exactly how it's going to turn out.
Thank you. And if you, Pedro, were to define some of those elements of that emerging order?
I think I actually had never thought about the challenges that we face in the way you described them, Nila. But I think we don't know simply. But perhaps with countries being forced to pursue and imagine new development pathways compared to those that have been pursued in the past, perhaps that's the opportunity that exists for lower income countries. I think we don't know where the new equilibrium is going to stand. But I agree with Paul. I think in particular there are these two important trends. One has to do with technological change, so that AI is going to continue to be there. The second is planetary change, a planet that is changing very rapidly, that is creating all sorts of new challenges to countries in terms of impact. So I think this will continue, and then overlay to these two, there is the geopolitics and the security concerns, which is somewhat new. So I think they are perhaps the three interacting with each other, and we don't know what the contours. At least I cannot see what the contours of the new order will be like.
Yeah. I mean, if I were to summarize very briefly what we found from the survey, it's this expectation that everything is changing, and all of that change will last a very long time. I mean, we roughly asked, how do you rate the current level of disruption on certain aspects? And then we asked, how long do you expect that current disruption to last? And if you plot those two things against each other, it sort of looks like everybody is in the top right corner for almost everything. So trade and global value chains, high levels of change and going to last a long time. Global economic institutions, high levels of change and lasting a long time. Innovation, technology, and data, high levels of change and lasting a long time. Natural resources, energy, environment, again, high. Some of the things that were maybe slightly lower than the others, public finances and fiscal policy, slightly less. Labor markets and human capital, slightly less, but maybe because the jury's still out. Financial markets and monetary policy, just slightly less than those other aspects. Private investment, capital allocation, slightly less. And then private consumption was probably the only area that was seen as relatively stable in these next few years. So looking at all of that, I mean, there's then a remarkable amount of resilience if this is the outlook. Your take?
One take I have, just listening to that and listening to the comments here, I had this question of who pays for it. And I think that's the disconnect. How things are financed in the short term versus their long-term effect. That's always been. There's a time inconsistency problem here. And what you're seeing in the US is more and more debt and kicking the can down the road, but that can is running into a brick wall pretty quickly. We've been talking about debt since I started out in my first year of college, and that was the dire warning, like, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago. It was a big warning then. But that is a reality now for advanced economies and emerging markets. It's, I'm an economist, so the price discipline is something I believe in wholeheartedly. But when it comes to investment with our global institutions on the back foot in many ways now, who pays for it is really the disconnect between this long-term optimism that we could see with structural change and how to get there in the transition. I'm still not clear. Maybe S&P has a view on that, but I'm still not clear. But at the same time, wealth creation is at all-time highs globally. There are more and more billionaires created every day, especially in this city. So the wealth is there, and again, it's a distribution issue of how do you get that wealth channeled into long-term structural benefit for the global economy versus other things that wealth could go to.
Yeah, and I think maybe the uncertainty was around global public goods, right? So, defense is one, environment is one, health is one, maybe technology, and maybe the institutions we have now aren't totally fit for purpose. So I'm probably one of the people who put it on the top right. I think we get there eventually. It's just very unsettling right now because a lot of things are changing very quickly, and it's tough to forecast as economists, as I'm sure my colleagues would agree. But some of these structural changes, we don't know where they're going to land. So I think until they do, we're going to be in this world that's a little bit unfamiliar, right, and a little bit uncomfortable for us.
Yeah. And I mean, to your point, lots of rising concern about debt and advanced economies, but this is a long-standing issue also in the developing world.
Absolutely.
And Pedro, your view on that?
Absolutely. And I think that the survey also asks about aid, for instance, and the decline in foreign aid. But I think the story here is more problematic because there's a squeeze coming out from the high debt levels in lower income countries, decline in aid, but also decline in investment. And this actually has been a trend that has been going on for a while. So I thought it was interesting that economists responding to the survey do not seem to be very worried about the decline in investment. But I think it's a big concern as well. So I think that countries, lower income countries, when it comes to access to finance and capital, face this triple squeeze. So high debt levels, so they have to service the debt. Aid is drying up, official development assistance, and investment is also declining.
Thank you. 45 minutes for a tour of the global economy at the speed that you've all just done that is a very tall order, and thank you so much for giving all of us here and our audience online a very good overview of where things currently stand and sharing your honest take on some of the uncertainties that we're currently seeing. This has been incredibly helpful. These findings underscore that growing concern, yes, but also I think point out the bright spots where things are resilient and where we may be moving towards greater divides and what might be the opportunities for greater convergence. For more detail, the full September edition of the Chief Economist's Outlook, published 3 times a year, is available on our website, weforum.org, along with features and analysis to help you explore its insights further. That brings us to the end of the discussion today. Many thanks to our panel of Chief Economists, Nila, Pedro, and Paul for sharing their perspectives, and to all of you for joining us here in the briefing room from the World Economic Forum. Thank you. Thank you.